Now that you've had a brief introduction to Egypt, let's move right into Egyptian sculpture. This is the Palette of Narmer, the oldest labeled work of art in existence today. This artifact has generated a lot of controversy. Maybe it commemorates the unification of Egypt after an actual battle. Maybe it presents a myth of unification. The answer really doesn't matter for our purposes. What we do know is that this work establishes canons of representation and introduces almost all of the abiding themes of Egyptian art. I'll begin with a rather odd practical point. This was a palette for mixing eye makeup. This mosaic shows an eye with a thick kohl makeup. So what do we see in this piece? What sculptural technique is used? Well, it's made of siltstone, a mud-based sedimentary rock. It's carved in low relief. But more importantly, how do its symbols represent the king's power and authority? Remember that this is the unifying theme of our ancient Near East unit. The Palette of King Narmer established important precedents for how kings would portray their rule in Egyptian art and emphasized two ways that the pharaoh supported his right to rule. What we call legitimacy in political science, a term you'll encounter again when you take AP government. So first, there's the religious justification. King Narmer appeals to the gods for protection, becomes the instrument of that protection, and becomes identified with the god himself. Second, and let's get practical here, he wins wars. Let's quickly compare this with the work of art we've already studied, the victory stele of Ramses. Here, too, we see the king vanquishing his enemies. Do you remember what the religious symbols were? Well, the horns are associated with the godlike power and virility, and the sun at the top symbolizes the gods. Again, remember that what was significant about this work of art was it was the first time that a leader claimed a status as a god. We will see that consistently in Egyptian works. So back to the palette, let's run through some of the symbolism, starting with the front. We see a larger-than-life King Narmer wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, slaying an enemy. Note the king's well-defined musculature and wide stance. Again, this conveys dominance and victory. We saw the same heroic body type and really stance on the victory stele of Ramses. We also see the falcon god Horus taking a papyrus plant captive. So what does that symbolize? Well, the plant symbolizes Lower Egypt. And although this is a little hard to see, Horus is holding a human arm that attaches to a rope holding the defeated enemy, again with the papyrus symbol of Lower Egypt. On top, we also see the symbol for the goddess Hathor. She is the divine mother of the pharaoh, and her symbol is a cow, since in Egyptian mythology she gave milk to the pharaoh. And of course, there are the obligatory dead enemies at the bottom. Turning to the back side of the palette, how does the king's headdress change? Well, now the king is wearing both crowns. He has unified Egypt. On the upper right, he is confronting 10 beheaded enemies. Again, it's a little tough to see, but they have their missing heads between their legs. What's most striking are these strange beasts. Are their intertwined necks a symbol of unification? We don't really know, but many similar figures show up in Mesopotamian works. From a more practical note, obviously creates a place where the eye makeup can be put. The heads appear to be lionesses. Again, that's a symbol of strength. In the lower register, we see a bull lowering his head and stepping on a dead enemy, and as usual, a naked enemy. Here again, the bull symbolizes strength and virility, and later Egyptian pharaohs would be called the bulls of Horus. Here's a slide with some of the symbols that appear in this and other works. Remember, you can find these PowerPoints on Moodle if you want to study these images further. I would draw your attention especially to the Ankh, the symbol of eternal life, and also to the headdress worn by Horus and most pharaohs in Egyptian art, a sun disk and a cobra. The cobra symbol is called a uraeus, and we will see this again. This slide offers a few more stylistic notes. The circled picture between the cow goddesses is the hieroglyph for Narmer, hence the palette's status as the first labeled work of art. Note that the registers are once again used to convey narrative. Narmer is shown in composite perspective. His face is in profile, his eye faces forward, his shoulders are frontal, but below the waist he is shown in profile. This becomes the convention for portraying pharaohs, and we'll see it again. And of course, this work exhibits hierarchy of scale. Narmer is bigger than his servant, shown on the left carrying his sandals, and his enemies are smaller still. And now we're moving to the height of the Old Kingdom. One of the three great pyramids at Giza is the Pyramid of Khafre, who's shown here. He's also probably the king whose face is on the Great Sphinx. See the resemblance? Notice again the man-beast symbolism that represents not only the strength of the lion, but the pharaoh's role as man-god. The statue is carved from diorite from Nubia. It's highly polished to bring out the natural striations. That's a term for the streaks in the rocks. So how does the nature of the stone help determine the style of Egyptian sculpture and also reflect the abiding ideology of the Egyptian rulers? Well, diorite is much harder than marble. Keeping the body compact makes the job of carving this very hard stone much easier, but again, it also fits Egyptian ideology. How? Well, the heavy block style conveys permanence, immobility, serenity. Notice, too, how serene and unchanging the face appears. Khafre seems to be staring right past us into a better world. It's hard to see this from a photo, but the statue stands about 5.5 feet tall. Moreover, it originally stood with 22 other statues of Khafre in his temple. That would have made a pretty imposing array. And this array of statues contributed to the cult of the dead king. Most of these statues would have contained niches for offerings of food, drink, and prayers. So here again, what visual symbols of royalty, power, and authority do you see? You should recognize the usual pharaonic headdress with the uraeus or cobra. There's the false beard, again a symbol of manhood, of manliness, virility. The throne's feet are lion paws. Lions are very often a symbol of kingship. And again, we see that perfect, vigorous body communicating strength and power. Here's a side view with still more iconography. It may be hard to see, but the carved figures on the throne are a lily and a papyrus, again representing the United Kingdoms of Upper and Lower Egypt. This also reinforces the notion of permanence. Egypt has been united for hundreds of years and will remain united. This imagery likewise ties Khafre and his successors to Egypt's founding. From this angle, we can see the lion's body more clearly. Note that the back legs are carved in low relief, while the front legs are carved in high relief, almost in the round. Art historians describe this as a cubic schema. The shape, I would have described it as more rectangular rather than cubic, but the shape of the block of stone remains clear. The sculpture is static. Some Egyptian statues, from the Middle Kingdom in particular, are really just simple stone blocks with a head. I think you see at least one example of that in your textbook. Here we still see more detail from this statue. Notice the falcon behind Khafre's head. So what's that about? Well, pharaohs were identified with Horus when living and Osiris when dead. But again, this is reinforcing the godly status, a source of power and authority for the pharaoh. Note how the bodies of the pharaoh and the falcon merge. Again, this melding of falcon and king represents the idea that the king is Horus while on earth, and again afterwards becomes Osiris. Finally, the statue provides a good illustration of one of our many vocabulary terms. The statue is bilaterally symmetrical. That is, it has a mirror image on a vertical axis. Again, this adds to the sense of calmness and permanence that the statue is intended to convey. Here again, we're back to Khafre as a sphinx. Note again the melding of the human and animal images with the symbolism of a lion, a very powerful animal. Note, too, how the designer, the artist, has used the headdress to blend the head and body seamlessly, conveying more symbols of pharaonic power, and maybe to suggest a mane as well as a headdress. Again, this idea of the lion imagery for the king and the melding of the god and the man in the role of the pharaoh. Menkare was Khafre's son. So what iconic elements do you see here? Well, at this point, you should recognize the symbols of power. Oops. Sorry. The stillness, the young, perfect muscular body. His wife's body is rather perfect as well, but note that she's smaller. This statue is rigidly frontal, as usual, and despite the seemingly affectionate pose, it really shows no emotion. The king doesn't seem to even notice that his wife is there. Note, too, that both figures follow the convention of putting the left foot forward. This conveys movement toward the afterlife, but otherwise the statue retains the immobility and permanence of Egyptian statuary art. And here you see, remember that the Canon of Proportions, rules for the relative size of body parts, reflected a conceptual rather than an optical view of art. So, for example, in order to show the left foot forward, the left leg has to be sculpted larger than the right leg. The canon of human proportions was a square grid of 18 units that was applied to a drawn standing human figure, allowing it to be reproduced in various sizes, but always with preset anatomical proportions. Now, we will encounter other and somewhat different canons of proportion in this class. It's a term you should know. It conveys interesting information about what any given culture considers proportionate or beautiful. Here we see a painted relief sculpture and another good example of hierarchy of scale. This work, by the way, shows up frequently on the AP test. What I find especially interesting is that the fish are portrayed more realistically and with a lot more movement. We'll see that over and over in Egyptian art, in both relief and sculpture and in painting. Animals and lower classes of people are shown with realistic detail. Pharaohs and upper-class individuals are not. So Egyptian artists used conventions deliberately, not just to take artistic shortcuts. They did know how to create more realistic art. This is the female pharaoh Hatshepsut. We'll learn more about her when we get to Egyptian architecture, but for now, again, same question, what symbols of power do you see? Well, there's her famous false beard, as well as the headdress with the cobra uraeus, famous, of course, because she would not have had any kind of a beard. According to the inscription on the base, Matkare, that's Hatshepsut, is represented here as one who gives Ma'at to Amun. Ma'at was the goddess of order, right, balance, and justice. And for a king to offer an image of Ma'at to another deity meant reaffirming that this was the guiding principle of his, or in this case, her rule. Again, notice the immobile, blocky form. Any guess about the stone? Actually, it's granite, which is another very hard stone. This is a rare statue in that Hatshepsut is shown with more feminine features. This image isn't in your book, but the person who taught my AP Teacher Institute recommended including it, and so I am. This was carved out of rock and cut up and moved to higher ground in 1968 when the Aswan Dam was built and the temple site was flooded. By the way, I should have noted, and didn't, that we've moved into, with Hatshepsut and with the Temple of Ramses II, to New Kingdom sculpture. The New Kingdom, remember, focused largely on temples, whereas the Old Kingdom works were associated more with pyramids. Why would a statue like this be erected in Nubia, in far southern Egypt? Well, that's where the Egyptians were defending their border, so it would have impressed and scared potential enemies. Pretty clearly, this was a monument to Ramses II's monumental ego. As your textbook points out, colossal statues tend to sacrifice artistic detail for immensity, but these really are impressive. You're going to look more at this temple, by the way, in the next lecture, which is going to be on architecture. I'm going to talk more about the Amarna period in my last lecture, but just a taste of treats to come. What is different about this statue? Well, this is not your ideal figure. I'm going to leave it at that for now, but we'll return to this. Here are a couple of terms that you should know. The statues are actually structural. These statues are actually structural elements. Atlantids are male support statues. Caryatids are female support statues. The Atlantids are more common in Egyptian sculpture. We'll see more caryatids when we get to Greek sculpture. Sorry. We've talked about how the nature of hard stone encouraged blocky statues. Note that this wood statue is more realistic. The guy has a paunch, but also uses conventions such as the left foot forward. Note that this is an official, not a pharaoh, so the artist had more leeway to show his real features. This isn't in your book, but the Metropolitan Museum of Art has bunches of these funerary sculptures of a riverboat conveying a passenger to the afterlife. I really like them, and I also think that they're an illustration, again, of the central importance of the afterlife in all Egyptian art. And basically, all Egyptian art is funerary. Oops. And since I'm sharing favorite pieces from my favorite museum, here's an example of additive or ceramic Egyptian sculpture from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. By the way, don't be fooled by this cute little guy whom the museum has nicknamed William. Hippopotami were fierce and dangerous beasts to the Egyptians since they knocked over those flimsy riverboats. This statue was probably intended to appease this malevolent animal. In my next lecture, we'll move on to architecture. You'll hear a lot less from me and see chunks of what I thought was a very interesting video.